In this episode, we're going to talk about something that quietly shapes a lot of intelligence work, even when people think they are being purely objective, which is bias and pressure around attribution. Attribution sits at an intersection where technical uncertainty meets human emotion, organizational politics, and outside expectations, so it is one of the easiest places for reasoning to drift without anyone noticing. Beginners often think bias is something that only happens when someone is careless or dishonest, but most attribution bias is subtle and unintentional. It can show up as a preference for a familiar story, a tendency to match evidence to what you have seen before, or a desire to provide a confident name to calm anxious leaders. External pressure can come from leadership, from partners, from the media environment, or even from your own desire to look competent under stress. If you learn to manage these forces, you will produce more accurate assessments, and you will protect your team's credibility in moments when it is most likely to be tested. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Bias in attribution often begins with anchoring, which is the tendency to latch onto the first plausible explanation and then interpret new evidence as support for it. In an incident, the first label you hear can become the anchor, such as a malware family name, an infrastructure match, or a similarity to a past case. Once anchored, your mind starts looking for confirmation and starts discounting contradictions, not because you are trying to be wrong, but because the brain likes coherent stories. This is why early attribution claims can become sticky even when they were initially tentative, because people repeat them, and repetition makes them feel true. Another common bias is availability, where the most memorable or recent threat you studied feels more likely to be responsible, simply because it is easy to recall. There is also pattern bias, where you see a familiar technique and assume it implies a familiar actor, even when that technique is widely used. Recognizing these biases is the first step, because you cannot manage what you do not notice. External pressure can amplify these biases by turning an analytical problem into a social problem, and social problems create different incentives. Leaders may press for a name because they think a name will help them explain the incident to others, or because they believe knowing the actor indicates the severity. Partners may press for attribution because they need to coordinate responses, and they may have their own narratives or priorities. News and industry chatter can create an expectation that major incidents always have a named adversary, which can seep into organizational thinking even when nobody says it out loud. In these contexts, an analyst can feel that uncertainty equals weakness, and that providing a confident label is the way to appear competent. That incentive is dangerous because it pushes you toward overreach, where the language becomes stronger than the evidence. Managing external pressure means recognizing when the incentive environment is trying to pull you away from evidence-driven reasoning. A useful way to manage bias is to build structured pauses into your workflow, where you deliberately ask yourself which conclusion you would draw if you did not know the current suspected actor name. This is a simple mental reset that helps you see whether the label is guiding the evidence rather than the evidence guiding the label. You can also ask what else could explain the same observations, such as tool sharing, infrastructure reuse, or an opportunistic actor following public playbooks. This does not mean you treat every alternative as equally likely, but it does mean you acknowledge that alternatives exist and you test whether your evidence really rules them out. Another helpful practice is to separate your analysis into layers, such as what is confirmed, what is strongly supported, and what is tentative, and then ensure your messaging respects those layers. If the only strong evidence you have is linkage between incidents, you do not jump to identity attribution. The structure itself becomes a guardrail that reduces bias-driven leaps. Managing bias also involves understanding the different types of evidence that are most vulnerable to interpretive drift. Weak artifacts like file names, compile timestamps, and superficial string matches are easy to overvalue because they are tangible and easy to compare. Infrastructure overlaps can also be overvalued when analysts assume control implies identity, even though infrastructure can be compromised, shared, or reused. Even technique matches can be overvalued when a technique is common, because common techniques should not narrow attribution much. Stronger evidence is often procedural, meaning the specific sequence, timing, and operational habits that repeat across incidents. These procedural signals are harder to mimic consistently and often provide a better basis for clustering. When you know which evidence types are fragile, you can resist the temptation to treat them as decisive. This is especially important under pressure because fragile evidence is often the first evidence you get, and first evidence has outsized influence. External pressure often manifests as urgency, and urgency can cause analysts to collapse careful language into simple headlines. A leader may say they need an answer now, or a meeting is in 10 minutes, or the board is asking. In that moment, your job is to provide decision-relevant clarity without inflating certainty, and that requires practiced discipline. One way to do that is to shift the conversation from who to what, meaning what behaviors are confirmed, what impacts are plausible, and what actions are recommended regardless of attribution. You can also provide a bounded attribution statement that is honest, such as activity aligns with a known cluster with moderate confidence, while identity attribution is not supported at high confidence at this time. The key is to pair that statement with actions and rationale, so leaders feel they have something solid to do. This reduces the emotional need for a name, because it replaces narrative comfort with operational control. Managing urgency is about giving leaders a path forward that does not depend on fragile attribution. Another form of external pressure is social consensus pressure, where a respected person or group believes the attribution is obvious and expects you to agree. This can happen internally when a senior engineer insists it is a particular actor based on a single indicator, or externally when a partner shares a strong attribution claim and expects alignment. The danger is that consensus can suppress skepticism, and skepticism is exactly what protects attribution quality. A disciplined response is to acknowledge the partner's view, ask what evidence they are relying on, and compare it to what you can observe in your environment. You can also explain that you are tracking the hypothesis, but that you need convergence across multiple evidence types before treating it as high confidence. This keeps relationships intact while protecting your analysis from being pulled into someone else's narrative. It also encourages a more evidence-based exchange, which improves collective understanding. Managing consensus pressure is not about being contrarian, it is about being precise. Attribution bias can also come from within the security team itself, especially when the team has invested effort and identity in a particular narrative. If people have brief leadership on a suspected actor, they may feel embarrassed to revise that view, so they subconsciously look for evidence that preserves the original claim. This is why creating a culture where reassessment is normal is so important, because it reduces ego attachment to early conclusions. You can manage this by treating attribution as a living assessment, where updates are expected as new signals emerge. You can also frame revisions as evidence improvement rather than correction, emphasizing that early hypotheses were reasonable given early data. When people feel safe to update their view, they are more likely to notice contradictions and to act on them. This cultural aspect is part of managing bias because bias thrives in environments where changing your mind is punished. A healthy intelligence culture makes accuracy the reward, not consistency with past statements. It is also useful to recognize the temptation to use attribution as a shortcut for severity, because that is a form of bias that can distort incident response. People may think that if the actor is famous or described as sophisticated, the incident must be catastrophic, while if the actor is described as opportunistic, the incident must be minor. This is not reliable because impact depends on what was accessed, what was changed, and how long control persisted, not on the label. Over-reliance on actor reputation can cause both overreaction and underreaction. A responsible approach is to assess severity based on observed behaviors, scope, and business impact, while treating attribution as context that may inform expectations but does not define reality. This keeps the response proportional and evidence-driven. It also prevents leaders from being misled by narratives that sound dramatic but do not map to the actual risk. Managing this shortcut temptation is part of maintaining analytical integrity. Practical guardrails can help you resist bias when pressure is high, and one of the strongest guardrails is forcing yourself to articulate what evidence would disprove your current attribution hypothesis. If you cannot name disconfirming evidence, you may be too attached to the hypothesis. Another guardrail is requiring multiple independent evidence categories before raising confidence, such as requiring convergence of capability traits and procedure-level behaviors rather than relying on infrastructure alone. Another guardrail is conducting a brief peer challenge, even if informal, where someone else asks what alternative explanations remain plausible. These guardrails are simple enough to use under time pressure, and they work because they slow down the brain's tendency to jump to closure. They also make your process more transparent, which helps leadership trust your updates. When you can explain that your confidence is based on converging evidence and that you have actively tested alternatives, your conclusion becomes sturdier. Guardrails turn good intentions into consistent practice. Managing external pressure also includes managing what you put into written communication, because written statements can become a permanent story. If a high-pressure meeting leads to an attribution label being written into a summary email, that label may be repeated for weeks even if it was based on weak evidence. A disciplined approach is to ensure that written communication uses sober language, distinguishes linkage from identity, and clearly labels confidence. It should also focus on actionable guidance and confirmed facts, so that readers do not treat attribution as the core takeaway. This reduces the risk that external pressure produces internal misinformation. It also provides a record that can be updated without contradiction, because the initial message was already calibrated. Managing written communication is a defensive move for your own team, because it protects you from having to unwind overconfident statements later. In many organizations, the written narrative becomes the incident memory, so controlling it responsibly matters. As we wrap up, managing attribution bias and external pressure is about protecting evidence-driven reasoning in an environment that naturally pushes for confident stories. Bias shows up through anchoring, availability, and pattern matching, and pressure shows up through urgency, consensus expectations, and the desire for a neat narrative. You manage these forces by building structured pauses, separating confirmed facts from tentative assessments, and using guardrails like seeking disconfirming evidence and requiring converging evidence categories before increasing confidence. You resist the urge to use attribution as a shortcut for severity, focusing instead on observed scope, behaviors, and impact. You handle social and partner pressure by asking for evidence, aligning to what you can observe, and keeping language sober and confidence calibrated. Finally, you manage the written narrative carefully so early hypotheses do not become permanent myths. When you practice these habits, you produce attribution assessments that remain credible under scrutiny and useful under pressure, which is exactly what decision-makers and defenders need most.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.